They said the speed of light was a universal law. The Galactic Council treated it like a sacred religion. Then humanity came along, too impatient, too broke, and too stubborn to respect the rules. We didn't gently fold space-time. We didn't ride elegant gravitational waves like the elder races. We built an engine that took a rusty crowbar to the universe's kneecaps. When the CSS Archimedes shattered reality to cross the galaxy in 3 seconds, we weren't trying to become gods. We just wanted to get the hell home. The engine room of the CSS Archimedes smelled like blown transformers and old pennies. Albert MacDonald leaned his forehead against the cold, vibrating bulkhead, letting the chill seep into his skin. He closed his eyes. His skull throbbed in time with the dying hum of the primary coils. A localized migraine, the ship's medic had called it, a side effect of being within 50 yards of a localized reality fracture. Albert just called it a Tuesday. He swallowed hard, tasting bile and the metallic tang of blood at the back of his throat. He brought a grime-stained sleeve to his nose. Red again. "Damn it!" he muttered, wiping the blood away and smearing it across his cheek. He didn't care. He was too tired to care. His coveralls clung to his back, damp with cold sweat, and his knees ached with a dull, persistent throbbing that reminded him he was pushing 50 in a job meant for someone 20 years younger. Behind him, the Borealis Drive sat in the center of the massive bay. It wasn't elegant. It didn't pulse with the serene, bioluminescent blues or soft purples favored by the Galactic Council's engineering casts. It was a brutalist nightmare of exposed wiring, dense lead shielding, and reinforced titanium strutting. It looked less like an engine and more like a bomb that had been paused mid-detonation. And that, fundamentally, was exactly what it was. The heavy blast doors hissed open, the sound dragging Albert out of his exhaustion. Sage Taylor stepped into the engine room, her boots clicking sharply against the grating. She looked like a walking corpse. Her hair, usually pulled back into a tight, professional bun, was frayed, strands sticking to her forehead. She was chewing on the inside of her cheek, a nervous habit she hadn't managed to kick since the prototyping phase back on Mars. "Tell me we didn't blow the containment field," Sage said. Her voice was raspy, dry. She didn't look at Albert. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the monstrosity in the center of the room. "Containment's holding at 89%, Albert replied, pushing himself off the bulkhead. His joints popped. "The primary baffles are warped, though. Heat sinks 3 through 7 are completely slagged, melted right down to the ceramic cores." Sage finally looked at him. She took in the grease on his face, the smeared blood under his nose, the exhausted slump of his shoulders. 89% is enough, she breathed, walking over to the nearest terminal. She tapped the glass screen, leaving a smudge of sweat. "We jumped." "Yeah, we jumped." Albert walked over to his workstation. It was littered with empty coffee bulbs and a half-eaten protein bar that tasted like sawdust and despair. He picked up a wrench, just to have something heavy and real in his hands. The metal was reassuringly solid. 40,000 light years, Sage whispered, staring at the telemetry data. "Albert, we did it. In 3 seconds. We crossed the Orion Arm in 3 seconds." "And broke the universe a little bit in the process?" Albert grunted. He tossed the wrench back onto the desk. It landed with a sharp clack. "You feel that jump, Sage? Really feel it? It wasn't like the old hyperspace lanes. The lanes feel like riding a smooth elevator. This felt like being turned inside out, shoved through a meat grinder, and glued back together by a blind man." Sage rubbed her temples. "I had a nosebleed too. Half the crew did. Medical is handing out ibuprofen like candy. But look at the data. The spatial tearing closed instantly behind us. The paradox field collapsed exactly as the math predicted. The math predicted a 10% chance we'd turn into a cloud of highly localized ionized gas," Albert pointed out, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. The numbers were raw, chaotic, a mess of quantum contradictions that the ship's computer was still struggling to parse. Humanity hadn't cracked faster than light travel by playing by the rules. The Galactic Council, a coalition of species so ancient and refined they communicated in micro-expressions and poetry, used Alcubierre-style warp drives. They compressed space in front of them and expanded it behind them. It was clean. It was mathematically pure. It was also slow. It took 6 months to cross a sector. Humanity didn't have 6 months. Humanity was facing resource depletion, territorial lock-in, and a distinct lack of patience. So when the Council refused to share their proprietary warp lane schematics, human engineers stopped trying to bend space. They decided to break it. The Borealis drive didn't fold reality, it shattered it, stepped into the resulting dimension of pure, chaotic energy, and forced a new exit point 40,000 light-years away, letting the universe's natural elasticity snap the tear shut behind them. It was violent, dirty, and horrifyingly loud. "We're alive," Sage said, her voice lacking any triumphant energy. She just sounded hollowed out. "And we're here, Sector 4, the edge of Council space." Ailby sighed, the sound rattling in his chest. "Yeah, we're here. So, what's the welcoming committee look like?" Sage chewed her cheek harder. "That's why I came down. Devin wants you on the bridge." Ailby frowned. "Me? I'm a grease monkey, Sage. I just keep the bomb from going off. Devin's the diplomat. Let him wear the nice suit and talk to the aliens." "They don't want to talk to the diplomat," Sage said, finally turning to face him fully. Her eyes were wide, haunted by a mixture of awe and sheer terror. "They want to talk to the person who built the bomb. They're panicking." Ailby, high above the engine room, on the observation deck of the Archimedes, Devin Wood was violently uncomfortable. His collar was too tight. The stiff, synthetic fabric of his diplomatic uniform chafed against his neck, a constant, irritating reminder of his role. He hated the suit. He hated the starch. He hated the fact that his palms were sweating profusely, forcing him to keep his hands clasped behind his back so no one would notice. Through the massive, heavily armored glass steel viewport, the stars were wrong. They weren't the familiar constellations of the Sol system, nor were they the sparse, dusty smudges of the outer colonies. They were blindingly bright, a dense, crowded cluster of ancient red giants and brilliant blue dwarfs, and positioned directly between the Archimedes and the nearest star were 6 Galactic Council dreadnoughts. They were beautiful. That was the first thing Devin thought when they dropped out of the fracture. The alien ships were sleek, teardrop-shaped vessels crafted from a seamless, pearl-white composite that seemed to catch and refract the starlight. They had no visible engines, no crude thrusters, no exposed weapon batteries. They looked like art installations. The Archimedes, by contrast, looked like a flying brick that had been repeatedly hit with a hammer. It was a brutal, utilitarian slab of grey armor, bristling with communication arrays, heat sinks, and point defense cannons. It was ugly, and right now it was surrounded. "Still no response to our hail, Ambassador," the COEM's officer, a young man named Taylor, who looked like he was barely out of academy, said. His voice trembled slightly. "They're just sitting there, scanning us." "Keep the channel open," Devin said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Broadcast the standard prime contact greeting, on a loop, and for God's sake, make sure the weapons array remains completely powered down. Weapons are offline, sir, but they're active scans. They're incredibly intrusive. They're bouncing multi-frequency penetrative beams off our hull. It's messing with the internal comms." Devin closed his eyes for a brief second. He had spent his entire career preparing for this. He had learned the intricate, delicate diplomatic protocols of the Council. He knew how to bow to an avian representative, how to avert his eyes when speaking to a reptilian delegate. He had studied their treaties. None of those treaties covered a ship appearing out of literal nowhere, bypassing their perimeter defense grids and arriving deep within their secure sector in a violent burst of exotic radiation. A console chirped. "Incoming transmission," Taylor said, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. "Audio and visual. It's coming from the lead dreadnought. Put it through," Devin ordered, straightening his posture and adjusting his collar one last time. Main screen. The stars vanished, replaced by the interior of the alien vessel. It was as pristine as the exterior, soft, diffused lighting, sweeping curves, devoid of any hard edges. In the center of the screen stood the Council representative. Humanity's translation software, a quirky, often overly literal AI, had long ago assigned standard Western names to specific alien vocal signatures to make them easier to parse. This particular alien, a tall, slender biped with skin the color of polished obsidian and 4 deeply intelligent violet eyes, had been assigned the name Charles. Devin had always found it absurd, but right now Charles did not look like a man you could joke with. Charles's mandibles, which normally rested flush against his jaw in a posture of calm indifference, were clicking rapidly, a sign of extreme distress. His 4 eyes were fixed on the screen, wide and unblinking. "Earth vessel Archimedes," Charles spoke. The translation software delivered his words in a crisp, synthesized British accent, though the underlying alien vocalizations sounded like glass grinding against stone. "You will cut your primary power. You will vent your drive core immediately. You will prepare to be boarded and quarantined." Devin blinked, caught off guard. Council protocol dictated a minimum of 3 minutes of formal greetings before any demands were made. Charles had skipped the pleasantries entirely. "Ambassador Charles," Devin began, projecting his best, most soothing diplomatic tone. "I assure you, we are on a peaceful mission of exploration and diplomatic outreach. We represent the United Earth." "You represent a localized temporal spatial collapse," Charles interrupted, his voice rising in pitch. The translation software struggled to keep up with his rapid speech, inserting minor stutters. "Our sensors detected a localized tear in the fabric of reality. The energy signatures match a collapsing star, yet it occurred within our secure perimeter. Where is the rest of your fleet? How did you bypass the hyperspace monitoring buoys?" "We didn't bypass them, Ambassador," Devin said calmly. "We simply didn't use the hyperspace lanes." Charles stared at him. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing moment. The clicking of his mandibles stopped entirely. "You did not use the lanes," Charles repeated, the translation flattening out into a monotone of utter disbelief. "There is no other way to travel faster than light. The lanes are the only stable topology in the universe." "Well, sir," Devin said, offering a small apologetic smile, "we found an alternative." "Impossible," Charles hissed. "Our scans show your vessel is leaking exotic radiation. Your hull temperature is currently 300 degrees above standard operational parameters. Your engine core is emitting paradoxical chronoton particles. You did not travel. You detonated reality and rode the shockwave." Devin winced internally. Put like that, it sounded incredibly bad. "It's a new prototype drive," Devin tried to explain. "Completely stable, I assure you. We are tracking microfractures in the local space-time continuum," Charles practically yelled. "You are not a diplomatic vessel. You are an ecological disaster. I demand to speak to the architect of this abomination now, before I authorize the fleet to vaporize your ship to prevent further contamination." Devin swallowed. The sweat on his palms felt freezing cold. "Of course, Ambassador. Please, give us a moment to bring our chief engineer to the bridge." He turned away from the screen, motioning for Taylor to mute the audio. Devin let out a long, ragged breath, running a hand over his face. "Taylor," Devin said quietly, "get MacDonald up here, now." The elevator ride from the lower decks to the bridge took exactly 90 seconds. For Ailby, it felt like 90 years. He hadn't bothered to change. He hadn't showered. He still smelled like ozone and old sweat. He had tried to wipe the grease off his hands with a rag, but the thick black oil had settled deep into the calluses and the cracks of his knuckles. His coveralls were stained, his boots were scuffed, and he was carrying a thermos of cold, bitter coffee that he clung to like a life preserver. Sage stood next to him in the elevator car, staring straight ahead. She was vibrating with nervous energy. "You can't talk to them like you talk to the maintenance crew," Sage said, her voice tight. "They are ancient, Elbe. They view the universe as a delicate ecosystem. We just drove a bulldozer through their rose garden." "I know what we did," Elbe said, taking a sip of the terrible coffee. He grimaced. "I built the bulldozer. Just be polite. Don't use metaphors. They don't translate well. Stick to the physics." "The physics are terrifying, Sage. If I stick to the physics, they'll shoot us on principle." The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open. The bridge was bathed in the harsh glare of emergency lighting and the glow of the massive observation screen. Devin Wood hurried over, his face pale. "MacDonald," Devin said, grabbing Ailba's arm. Ailba flinched slightly at the contact. "Thank God. Listen to me. The council rep is terrified. He thinks we're a walking space-time anomaly. You need to explain to him that the drive is safe." "It's not safe," Elbe said bluntly. "It's highly volatile." "Lie," Devin hissed. "Or at least soften the truth. Get up there." Elbe sighed, his shoulders slumping. He shuffled toward the center of the bridge, stopping right in front of the primary communication pickup. He looked up at the massive screen, at the four-eyed, obsidian-skinned alien glaring down at him. Elbe didn't bow. He didn't offer a traditional greeting. He just took a sip of his coffee, set the thermos down on a nearby console, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You wanted the architect," Ailbe said, his voice gravelly and exhausted. "I'm Ailbe MacDonald, chief engineer." Charles leaned closer to his own screen. "You are the one who designed this engine? Me and a team of about 400 overworked, sleep-deprived lunatics back in Nevada. Yeah. Explain your containment protocols," Charles demanded. "Our sensors indicate that to achieve your transit, you must have bypassed the universal constant of light by tearing the dimensional fabric. How did you stabilize the resulting quantum paradox? The energy required to maintain a dimensional fracture without consuming the vessel is equivalent to a Class 4 star." Ailbe scratched his jaw, feeling the rough stubble there. "We didn't stabilize it." The bridge of the Archimedes went dead silent. Devin made a small, choked noise in the back of his throat. On the screen, Charles's mandibles flared outward. You did not stabilize it? Then how are you not a localized smear of fundamental particles?" "We didn't try to hold the door open," Ailbe explained, pointing a grimy finger at the screen. "That's your mistake. You guys try to control everything. You try to build a safe, stable tunnel through subspace. Takes too much energy. It's too slow." Ailbe picked up his coffee again, swirling the dark liquid. "We figured out that the universe wants to heal itself. It hates a vacuum, and it hates a paradox even more. So we don't hold the tear open. We blow a hole in reality, and we just jump into the gap. We ride the shockwave of the universe, violently snapping back together behind us. The paradox field collapses, and the resulting kinetic expulsion shoots us out the other side." Charles stared. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence. You detonate a hole in the fabric of existence, and you surf the resulting cosmic backlash? "Pretty much. That is insanity," Charles whispered, the translation software perfectly capturing the profound horror in his tone. "The margin for error. If your vessel is off by a fraction of a microsecond, the collapsing reality would crush your ship down to the size of a single atom. "Yeah, well," Ailbe muttered, looking down at his scuffed boots. "That's why we have to recalibrate the primary chronometer after every jump. It's a bit of a hassle. Eats through heat sinks like you wouldn't believe." "A hassle?" Charles repeated. The alien seemed to be physically recoiling. "You are weaponizing the fundamental structure of the universe for transit. Do you understand the long-term degradation? The sheer recklessness?" "Look, buddy," Ailbe said, suddenly feeling a surge of genuine annoyance. He was too tired for a lecture from an alien who lived in a sterile, perfect ship. "We spent 200 years begging you guys for the warp lane schematics. You told us we weren't mature enough. You told us to wait, so we didn't wait. We used what we had. We had a lot of dense metals, some really math-heavy computers, and a desperate need to not die on our own dying rock." Ailbe leaned heavily onto the console, looking directly into the alien's eyes. "It's loud, it's ugly, and it makes my nose bleed, but it works, and we can build one of these drives in a month for the cost of a decent planetary defense grid. We aren't here to break your universe. We're just here to let you know that we aren't stuck in the mud anymore." Charles was silent. The entire council fleet outside remained motionless, hovering in the void like silent ghosts. "You built a suicide engine," Charles finally said, his voice barely more than a breath. "And you mass-produced it." Ailbe gave a grim, tired smile. "Welcome to humanity, Ambassador. We're here. Now, can we dock? I really need a hot shower and a decent cup of coffee." The docking clamps engaged with a violent, metallic scream that reverberated through the hull of the Archimedes. Ailbe felt the vibration in his teeth. He gripped the edge of the airlock bulkhead, letting the heavy shudder travel up his arms and dissipate into his aching shoulders. Beside him, Devin Wood was frantically trying to smooth out the wrinkles in his diplomatic jacket. He looked like a man preparing for his own execution, attempting to ensure his tie was straight for the firing squad. "Stand up straight, for God's sake," Devin hissed at a pair of security guards flanking the heavy blast doors. The guards, wearing bulky, scuffed riot gear that smelled faintly of stale sweat and synthetic polymer, stiffened awkwardly. "They're coming aboard a flying scrap heap, Devin," Ailbe muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The localized migraine was creeping back, a dull thud behind his left eye. "Posture isn't going to distract them from the duct tape holding the ventilation shafts together. It's about projecting authority, MacDonald," Devin snapped back, his voice trembling. "We are representatives of Earth. We must look like we belong out here. We don't, Sage said quietly from Elba's other side. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her fingernails digging into her sleeves. We kick the door down. You don't ask for a coaster after you kick a man's door down. Before Devin could respond, the heavy locking mechanism of the primary airlock began to cycle. It was a crude system compared to Council technology, a series of massive hydraulic deadbolts that clanked and groaned as they retracted. The pressure equalized with a sharp, aggressive hiss, blowing a gust of air from the alien vessel into the human corridor. Elbe inhaled. It smelled like cold mint, sterile water, and something metallic, like the static discharge of a freshly printed circuit board. It was entirely devoid of life. No sweat, no grease, no burnt coffee, just pristine, absolute sterility. The blast doors slid apart, grinding on tracks that desperately needed lubrication. Ambassador Charles stepped through the threshold. Up close, the alien was even more imposing. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, wrapped in seamless, flowing garments that shifted colors subtly, from charcoal gray to deep midnight blue as he moved. Behind him stepped 4 guards. They didn't wear armor, they wore liquid metal. It clung to their slender frames, rippling with a soft internal light. They carried weapons that looked like polished tuning forks. Charles stopped abruptly. His 4 violet eyes blinked in rapid succession. His mandibles twitched. "The gravity," Charles said. The translation software, piped through a small silver device pinned to his collar, sounded strained. "It is oppressive. It fluctuates." "Rotational centrifuge systems supplemented by localized mass plating," Elba said, not bothering to introduce himself again. He crossed his arms, matching Sage's defensive posture. "It keeps our bones from turning to jelly, but it stutters when the power grid diverts to life support. You get used to it." Charles slowly turned his head, taking in the corridor. He looked at the exposed wiring running along the ceiling, secured by heavy-duty zip ties. He looked at the condensation dripping from a cooling pipe, pooling on the grated floor. He looked at the rust creeping along the baseboards. He didn't look disgusted. He looked profoundly horrified. "You traverse the void in this," Charles murmured. It wasn't a question. Devin stepped forward, forcing a wide, painfully artificial smile. "Ambassador Charles, welcome aboard the CSS Archimedes. I am Devin Wood, Chief Diplomat of—" "I have no interest in your titles, Devin Wood," Charles interrupted, his voice flat. He bypassed the diplomat entirely, his gaze locking onto Elbe. "You, Elbe MacDonald, take me to the machine." Devin deflated, his mouth snapping shut. He looked at Elbe, giving a frantic, jerky nod. "Right this way," Elbe grunted. He turned on his heel, his heavy boots thudding against the metal grating. The procession moved through the ship. The silence was thick, broken only by the ambient noise of the Archimedes itself. The ship was alive, and it sounded like a dying asthmatic. Ventilation fans squealed, bulkheads groaned under the microscopic stresses of the gravity plating, and a low, persistent thrum vibrated through the floorboards. Elbe led them down a narrow stairwell. The elevators were notoriously unreliable. After a jump, the alien guards moved with an unsettling, liquid grace, their boots making absolutely no sound against the metal stairs. Elba felt like a lumbering bear leading a pack of predatory ghosts. "Your atmospheric mixture," Charles noted as they descended into the lower decks. "It contains high levels of carbon dioxide and volatile hydrocarbons." "Engine fumes," Sage offered from behind him. Her voice was tight, but she was forcing herself to look at the ambassador. "The seals on the lower decks aren't perfect. We vent the excess into space when it reaches a toxic threshold. You breathe your own exhaust until it becomes fatal, and then you open a window," Charles translated, his tone entirely devoid of inflection. "Fascinating," Elba snorted. "If you think the air is bad here, wait until you see the basement." He slammed his hand against a heavy red button. The blast doors to the engine deck ground open. A wave of heat hit them instantly, rolling out into the corridor like the breath of an oven. It didn't just smell like burned reality anymore. It smelled like raw, blistered iron, melting plastic, and the sharp, coppery tang of ionized air. It smelled like a war zone. The alien guards stopped dead at the threshold of the engine room. One of them raised his tuning fork weapon, a low, ominous hum vibrating from its prongs. "Ambassador," one of the guards chirped, a rapid series of clicks and whistles that the translation software hurriedly caught up with. "Ambient radiation levels are spiking. Exotic particle decay detected. It is not safe." Charles held up a slender, six-fingered hand. The guard lowered the weapon, but didn't relax. Charles stepped into the sweltering heat of the engine room. Ailbe walked past him, heading straight for his workstation. He needed his coffee. He didn't care that it was cold. He grabbed the thermos, unscrewed the lid, and took a long drag. The bitter liquid cut through the taste of ozone in his mouth. Charles stood perfectly still in the center of the room, staring at the Borealis drive. The machine was still angry. It sat in its reinforced cradle, a chaotic mass of lead, titanium, and blackened ceramic. The cooling systems were screaming, pumping thousands of gallons of superchilled liquid nitrogen through the secondary baffles. The pipes were caked in thick white frost, creating a stark contrast against the cherry-red glow of the main containment vessel. Every few seconds, the metal chassis would pop, a sharp, violent sound like a gunshot as the extreme heat contracted. "By the ancestors," Charles breathed. He reached into his robes and pulled out a small, sleek silver cylinder. He waved it toward the engine. A holographic display projected into the air, completely silent, showing a cascade of red and black alien geometry. The shape spun and twisted, trying to process the data coming off the drive. "Your scanner's going to fry if you point it directly at the core housing," Ailbe warned, leaning against his desk. "It's still venting chronoton radiation. It messes with delicate electronics." Charles ignored him. He took a step closer to the heavy lead shielding. This is not a warp drive." "Told you," Ailbe said. "It is a crude matter, antimatter reactor hooked into a rudimentary gravity generator," Charles muttered, tracing the lines of the engine with his eyes. "But these modifications, you have forced the gravity waves to invert. You are creating a localized singularity." "Just for a microsecond," Sage interjected, stepping up beside Ailbe. She couldn't help herself. Her engineering pride was warring with her terror. "Long enough to punch a hole. The antimatter reaction provides the brute force, but the actual tear is caused by a tachyon pulse array synchronized to the singularity's collapse." Charles turned his four eyes onto Sage. "A tachyon pulse? Unregulated? You are firing blind into the sub-dimensional strata. How do you aim?" "We don't," Ailbe said bluntly. Charles froze. "You do not aim. Space is mostly empty, Ambassador," Ailbe said, setting the thermos down. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. The heat in the room was oppressive, sticking his clothes to his skin. "We do the math. We calculate the trajectory, factor in planetary drift and stellar gravitation, and we point the ship in the general direction. We fire the pulse, create the tear, and jump. We aim for a sector, not a specific coordinate. A margin of error of light years," Charles whispered. The holographic display hovering above his scanner suddenly shorted out, dissolving into a flurry of blue sparks. He didn't even flinch. He just dropped the dead cylinder onto the grated floor. "If you re-entered real space inside a star or a populated planet, then we die," Ailbe said. His voice was hard, stripped of any sarcasm. "We get instantly vaporized. We knew the risks when we strapped this thing to the back of the ship." Charles looked at Ailbe, truly looking at him for the first time. He saw the deep, bruised bags under the human's eyes. He saw the grease stained deep into his cuticles. He saw the faint tremor in Ailbe's hands, a symptom of the microdoses of exotic radiation they absorbed with every jump. "Why?" Charles asked. The translation software couldn't fully capture the depth of his confusion, but the sheer alien bewilderment was palpable. "Why would a species subject themselves to this? This is not exploration. This is self-immolation. You are burning your own biology to cross the stars." Ailbe looked away. He looked at the blackened heat sinks, the warped titanium. He felt the dull ache in his knees and the throbbing in his skull. He knew what the drive was doing to him. He knew that every time they jumped, a tiny part of his cellular structure forgot how to put itself back together. "Because we were dying anyway," Ailbe said softly. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, crushing exhaustion. "Our sun is stable, but our soil is dead. We strip-mined our system dry just to build the colony ships. And when we asked the Council for the warp lane technology to find a new home, you looked at our resource projections and decided we weren't a viable investment. Albu pushed himself off the desk, walking slowly toward the massive engine. He reached out, stopping his hand an inch from a heavily shielded strut, feeling the blistering heat radiating off the metal. "You build beautiful, perfect machines, Ambassador," Albu said, staring into the red glow of the containment vessel. "Because you have the luxury of time. You have thousands of years of peace and unlimited resources. You look at the universe as a puzzle to be elegantly solved." He turned back to look at the alien. "We don't have time. We have a gun to our heads. So we didn't solve the puzzle. We took a hammer and smashed the board." Charles stood in the oppressive heat, the silence of the room broken only by the violent popping of the cooling metal. The disgust on his face had entirely vanished. It had been replaced by a slow, creeping dread. The Council had always assumed humanity would quietly choke to death in their own isolated system, a tragic but statistically common end for a crude species. They had not anticipated that a crude species, backed into a corner, would figure out how to strap a bomb to the fabric of reality. "You have mass-produced this engine," Charles said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. 400 more are rolling off the assembly line on Luna as we speak," Devin Wood said, stepping forward. He had finally found his diplomatic footing, realizing the leverage they held, fitted to colony ships, freighters, and defensive dreadnoughts. Charles closed his eyes, all four of them. He stood like a statue in the sweltering heat of the engine room for a long, agonizing minute. "Your drive creates subspace fractures," Charles said, opening his eyes. "Repeated use in a concentrated area will destabilize the local galactic arm. You will rip the Orion spur to shreds." "Then I guess we need better engines," Albu said, crossing his arms. "Shame we don't know how to build stable warp drives." Charles stared at the grease-stained, bleeding, exhausted human. The realization settled over the alien ambassador like a shroud. The humans weren't asking for permission anymore. They weren't asking for charity. They were holding a detonator, threatening to blow up the entire galactic neighborhood unless they were given a seat at the table. It was barbaric. It was ugly. It was the most effective piece of diplomacy Charles had ever seen. "I will contact the High Council," Charles said softly. "I believe an exchange of technology is suddenly in our mutual interest." The water in the cramped shower stall of the Archimedes was universally terrible. It was recycled, smelling faintly of iodine and old copper pipes, and the pressure was little more than an asthmatic trickle. Right now, to Albu, it felt like holy water. He stood under the tepid spray, his head bowed, letting the water run over the back of his neck. He held a block of industrial pumice soap in his right hand, scrubbing at his left forearm until the skin was raw and bright pink. The heavy grease from the Borealis drive had sunk deep into his pores. It felt like it had stained his actual bones. He dropped the soap. It hit the fiberglass floor with a dull thud. Albu leaned his forearms against the wet wall, closing his eyes. The tremor in his hands was getting worse. It wasn't a violent shake, just a high-frequency vibration running through his muscles, as if a localized electric current was permanently trapped beneath his skin. The medical bay called it chronoton-induced neuropathy, a fancy way of saying his nervous system was slowly unraveling from proximity to the paradox field. He coughed, a harsh, rattling sound that tore at his throat, and spat a glob of pink-tinged phlegm toward the drain. They had won. That was the reality of the situation. They had successfully blackmailed the oldest, most advanced coalition of species in the known galaxy by threatening to accidentally delete the local star cluster. It was the most human victory imaginable, loud, messy, and built on a foundation of sheer, unadulterated desperation. The locker room door hissed open, letting in a draft of dry, conditioned air. "McDonald? You decent?" It was Devin. The diplomat's voice was entirely different from an hour ago. The tight, terrified squeak was gone, replaced by the resonant, booming baritone of a man who had just secured his place in history books. "I'm naked and bleeding, Devin," Albu yelled over the pathetic spray of the shower. "So, no, but come in anyway." Albu twisted the rusted knob, shutting off the water. He grabbed a thin, scratchy towel and wrapped it around his waist, stepping out of the stall. He didn't bother drying his hair. It clung to his forehead in wet, graying clumps. Devin Wood stood in the center of the locker room. He had taken off his stiff diplomatic jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his white shirt. He looked flushed, practically radiating a manic, triumphant energy. He held a sleek, pearl-white data crystal in his hand. "They capitulated," Devin breathed, staring at the crystal as if it were the Holy Grail. "Complete, unconditional technology transfer, the warp lane coordinates, the subspace stabilization matrices, the Alcubierre field generators, all of it." Aelber sat heavily on the wooden bench, grabbing another towel to dry his face. The coarse fabric felt good against his skin, grounding him. "What's the catch?" Devin looked up, his smile faltering slightly. "They want the Borealis drive dismantled. Not just ours, all of them. They are deploying observation teams to Sol to oversee the decommissioning of the production lines on Mars and Luna. They're terrified, Aelber. I sat in a room with a being that has a recorded lineage of 10,000 years, and he looked at me like I was holding a live hand grenade with the pin pulled. "We are," Aelber grunted. He looked down at his shaking hands. "The drive is a monster. I'll be glad to take a blowtorch to the bastard." "But it worked," Devin insisted, stepping closer. "You did it, Aelber. You saved us. Earth is going to survive. We can reach the uncolonized sectors now without relying on sub-light generation ships. We have the keys to the kingdom." Aelber looked at the diplomat. He saw the genuine awe in Devin's eyes, and it made Alber's stomach twist. There was an internal contradiction gnawing at him, a bitter pill he couldn't quite swallow. He hated the Borealis drive. He hated what it did to his body. He hated the smell of it. He hated the screaming metal and the sheer, terrifying unpredictability of the jump. But it was theirs. They hadn't waited for the ancient, enlightened races to deem them worthy. They had crawled into the dirt, scraped together the leftover pieces of a dying solar system, and built a sledgehammer that shattered the unbreakable rules of the cosmos. Giving it up, trading it away to become just another species riding the Council's sanitized, pre-approved highways, felt like a bizarre kind of surrender. "When do we start the transfer?" Aelber asked, pushing the philosophical dread down. He was too tired for pride. He just wanted to go to sleep. "Now," Devin said. "Sage is setting up the interface in the secondary server room. Ambassador Charles is sending over one of their chief architects to oversee the handshake. They don't trust our systems to process the data without corrupting it." Aelber let out a short, cynical bark of a laugh. "They're right not to. Our mainframes are held together by spit, prayers, and bypass safety protocols. Let me get dressed. I want to see the look on the alien's face when he realizes our firewall is just a modified spam filter." The secondary server room on the Archimedes was a cramped, rectangular box located 3 decks above the engine room. It was painfully cold, kept at a constant 40 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent the overclocked processing banks from melting into a puddle of slag. The air hummed with the deafening roar of industrial cooling fans. Sage Taylor stood shivering in a thick, insulated parka, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She was typing furiously on a physical keyboard. Standing beside her was the Council architect. Unlike Ambassador Charles, who wore flowing robes, this alien, who introduced herself through the translator as Architect Vial, wore a form-fitting environmental suit. The suit was matte black, covered in subtle glowing silver circuitry that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She was slightly shorter than Charles, with a secondary pair of arms folded neatly against her abdomen. Her 4 eyes were currently fixed on the human server racks, with an expression of profound, existential despair. Aelber walked in, zipping up a grease-stained jacket. He instantly regretted leaving the warm, humid air of the locker room. The cold bit into his joints, making his knees throb with renewed intensity. "How's the marriage of 2 completely incompatible technologies going?" Aelber asked, his voice competing with the roar of the fans. Sage didn't stop typing. "It's like trying to teach a pocket calculator how to compose a symphony. Their data crystal uses a multidimensional quantum state storage medium. Our servers read binary." Architect Vial turned her head. Her mandibles clicked slowly, a sound of distinct disapproval. "Your entire processing architecture is linear. It is primitive. It relies on physical logic gates. The latency alone is astronomical. We are attempting to pour an ocean of data into a fractured teacup." "Well," It's a very resilient teacup, Elbe said, leaning against the doorframe. He pulled a crumpled pack of antacids from his pocket and popped 2 into his mouth. They tasted like chalk and peppermint. Just throttle the output. Send it in chunks. Text files. Basic schematics first. We don't need the poetic history of your warplanes, just the math. The mathematics are deeply intertwined with the harmonic resonance of subspace, Vielle explained, her translated voice sounding incredibly exasperated. You cannot simply strip the context. The warplanes are a delicate ecosystem. The equations require absolute precision. Lady, Elbe said, chewing the chalky tablets. We just spent an hour explaining how we tore a hole in the universe using a bomb and a prayer. We aren't really big on delicate. Just give us the blueprints for the stabilization rings. We'll figure out the rest. Vielle reached out with one of her lower arms, gently pressing a long, elegant finger against the metal casing of the human server rack. She recoiled slightly, as if the metal had burned her. It vibrates, Vielle said softly. Your entire ship, it constantly vibrates. There is no harmony, only friction. Yeah, that's the point, Sage muttered, finally hitting the enter key with a definitive clack. We use friction to generate momentum. Okay, I've bypassed the tertiary firewall and opened a direct, unencrypted line to the crystal reader. Vielle, you're up. Hit the button. Vielle produced the pearl-white crystal Devin had brought aboard. She slotted it into a crude, jerry-rigged adapter Sage had soldered together from an old communications array. The adapter looked absurd, a tangle of copper wiring and duct tape holding an impossibly elegant piece of alien technology. Vielle tapped the surface of the crystal. It bloomed with a soft, internal blue light. Instantly, the human server racks screamed. The cooling fans kicked into overdrive, a deafening mechanical whine filling the small room. The LED indicators on the databanks turned solid red, flashing frantically as terabytes of highly advanced, multi-dimensional alien data slammed into the human mainframes. Elbe watched the primary monitor. Cascades of alien geometry, similar to what Charles's scanner had shown, flooded the screen, quickly followed by the human translation software desperately trying to convert it into readable schematics. Lines of code, mathematical formulas, and 3D wireframe models of Alcubierre warp drives began to render. It was beautiful. It was clean, elegant, and perfectly balanced. It was the antithesis of the Borealis drive. Containment fields are holding, Sage yelled over the noise, her eyes glued to the temperature gauges. Data transfer is at 12%. It's working. The teacup is holding the ocean. Vielle stepped back, her forearms crossing over her chest. She watched the human systems struggle and groan, a look of grudging respect slowly replacing her horror. Your machines are crude, but they possess a certain stubborn endurance, much like your species. Elbe didn't reply. He was staring at the screen, watching the elegant curves of the alien warp drive blueprint. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt the immense weight of the universe lifting off his shoulders. Instead, a sharp, sudden pain spiked behind his left eye. It was worse than the migraine. It felt like an ice pick driving straight through his orbital bone. Elbe gasped, clapping a hand over his eye, his knees buckling. He stumbled forward, hitting the edge of the server console hard enough to rattle the metal casing. Elbe, Sage's voice cut through the noise, thick with panic. Elbe tried to speak, to tell her he was fine, but his jaw clamped shut. A hot, wet sensation trickled down his upper lip. He pulled his hand away from his face. His palm was smeared with dark, thick blood. It wasn't a standard nosebleed. It was pouring from his nose and the corner of his left eye. The room began to spin. The harsh glare of the monitors blurred into a smear of neon light. The high-frequency tremor in his hands suddenly amplified, spreading into his arms, his chest. He was vibrating, his own cells rebelling against the lingering chronoton radiation in his system. "Medical! Get a medic down here!" Sage was screaming, grabbing Elbe by the shoulders to keep him from collapsing to the floor. Architect Vielle stepped forward, pulling a small silver diagnostic tool from her suit. She swept it over Elbe. The tool emitted a sharp, frantic chirping sound. "His cellular structure is degrading," Vielle said, the translator entirely devoid of emotion, contrasting starkly with the chaos of the room. "The exotic radiation from your crude engine, it has saturated his bone marrow. He is experiencing localized temporal dissonance. His cells are attempting to exist in 2 separate timelines simultaneously." "Fix him," Sage yelled, struggling under Elbe's weight. Ailby felt his legs give out completely. He slumped against Sage, his vision fading to a narrow, dark tunnel. The roar of the server fans faded, replaced by the deep, resonant booming of his own erratic heartbeat. He looked up at the blurry outline of the alien architect. He wanted to laugh. He had built the engine that brought humanity to the stars, and the damn thing was going to kill him before he even got to see the view. "Told you," Elba wheezed, tasting copper and iron as he slipped into the dark. "It wasn't safe." Elba woke to the smell of burning sugar and bleach. He didn't open his eyes immediately. The fluorescent lights of the medical bay were always set to a harsh, unforgiving white that pierced right through his eyelids. He focused on his body. The high-frequency vibration was gone. In its place was a heavy, leaden numbness, as if his bones had been replaced with wet sand. Every time his heart beat, he felt a strange, icy prickle rush through his veins. It felt like cold carbonation. He tried to swallow, but his throat was like sandpaper. He cracked his eyes open, squinting against the glare. The ceiling was stained with a yellow watermark, shaped vaguely like South America. It was a comforting, familiar imperfection. "Don't try to sit up," a voice said. Sage pulled a rolling stool up to the side of his cot. She looked worse than he felt. The dark circles under her eyes had deepened into bruised hollows, and her hair was a tangled mess. She held a plastic cup of water, the kind with the bendy straw that Ailby absolutely despised. "I'm not an invalid," Ailby croaked. He pushed his elbows into the thin, uncomfortable mattress, trying to leverage himself upward. His abdominal muscles violently cramped, a sharp spasm that stole his breath. He collapsed back onto the pillow with a heavy sigh. "Okay, maybe a little." Sage guided the straw to his lips. He drank. The water was lukewarm and tasted heavily of iodine, but it was the best thing he had ever consumed. "You've been out for 30 hours, Sage said, pulling the cup away. She rested her elbows on her knees, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. "Your cellular matrix started to destabilize. The ship's doctor didn't know what to do. He tried to pump you full of broad-spectrum rad blockers, but it was like throwing a glass of water on a grease fire." "The aliens," Ailby rasped, looking down at his arm. There was a faint, silvery sheen around the IV insertion point. It didn't look like human medicine. "They fixed me." "Architect Vielle," Sage corrected softly. "She brought over some kind of targeted nanite therapy, microscopic drones. They went into your bloodstream and literally stitched your DNA back together. They pulled the exotic radiation out of your marrow molecule by molecule. She said if we had jumped one more time, you would have dissolved into a localized puddle of chronoton plasma." Ailby let his head loll to the side. Good to know the safety margins were accurate. "It's not a joke, Ailby," Sage snapped, her voice cracking. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed, exhausted tears. "You almost died on that server room floor. Half the engineering crew is sitting in the quarantine ward next door right now, getting the same nanite flush because they've been breathing the same air you have. The drive was killing us." "I knew it was killing us," Ailby said quietly. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were perfectly still. It was profoundly unsettling. "We all knew. We just didn't talk about it." The heavy medical bay doors hissed open. Devin Wood walked in. He had traded his diplomatic suit for a pair of standard-issue ship fatigues, but he carried himself with a new, heavy authority. He held a thick stack of printed paper, actual paper, a luxury reserved for finalized ironclad treaties. "MacDonald," Devon said, stopping at the foot of the bed. He offered a tight professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Glad to see you awake. The Council medical tech is nothing short of miraculous. It feels like I have ginger ale flowing through my arteries, Devin. What's the damage?" Devin sighed, resting the stack of papers on the edge of the cot. "The data transfer is complete. We have the Alcubierre schematics. The Earth forces back in Sol are already spinning up the new manufacturing nodes. We can build their drives, safe, clean, mathematically perfect warp engines." "And the Borealis?" Ailby asked. He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear the diplomat say it. "Decommissioned," Devon said flatly. "Across the board. The Council fleet is escorting us back to Sol via the established hyperspace lanes. They've attached a localized warp bubble generator to our hull to pull us along. Once we arrive, they will oversee the dismantling of the primary production lines. The Archimedes core is to be powered down permanently, starting today." Ailby stared at the yellow water stain on the ceiling. They were going home. They were going to survive. Humanity was going to spread out across the stars, riding the elegant, frictionless highways of the ancient races. No more bleeding from the eyes, no more burnt ceramic and screaming metal, no more gambling the existence of the ship on a blind tear in reality. He should have been ecstatic. He should have been crying tears of joy. Instead, a profound, hollow ache settled into his chest. It was the crushing weight of obsolescence. He had spent the last 5 years of his life sleeping under a desk in a freezing Nevada bunker, bleeding over blueprints, fighting for every scrap of titanium to build the engine that just saved their species. And now, it was trash, an embarrassing, barbaric mistake that the adults in the room were quietly sweeping under the rug. "They're taking our teeth, Devin," Ailby murmured. "They're giving us a future," Devin corrected gently. He tapped the stack of treaties. "This isn't surrender, Ailby. This is graduation. We forced them to the table. We won." "Yeah," Ailby said, turning his head to look at the blank white wall. "I guess we did." The engine room was cold. For the first time since the Archimedes had launched from the orbital shipyards, the heavy blast doors to the lower deck were propped open without a wave of blistering heat rolling out into the corridor. The massive industrial fans had been shut down. The deafening roar of the cooling systems was gone. It was quiet, too quiet. Ailby walked into the bay, leaning heavily on a cane the medical staff had insisted he use. His legs still felt like rubber, and his chest ached with every breath, but he had refused to stay in the bed. He needed to be here for this. Sage was already at the primary control console. She had a thick canvas tool bag slung over her shoulder. She wasn't typing. She was just staring through the reinforced glass steel partition at the Borealis drive. The machine looked dead. Without the cherry-red glow of the containment vessel, the drive was just a massive, ugly lump of grey metal and blackened lead. The frost had melted off the cooling pipes, leaving puddles of stagnant, oily water on the grated floor. The smell of ozone and burnt reality had faded, replaced by the damp, metallic scent of a wet junkyard. Ambassador Charles stood on the far side of the room, flanked by 2 of his liquid metal guards. The alien watched the human engineers with a careful, guarded expression. He no longer looked horrified. He looked relieved. Ailby limped over to the console, stopping beside Sage. He leaned his cane against the desk and placed his hands flat on the cold metal surface. "Everything vented?" Ailby asked, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, silent cavern of the engine room. "Antimatter reserves are locked down and transferred to the primary holding tanks," Sage replied smoothly, though her voice lacked any energy. "The tachyon arrays are physically disconnected. The chronoton baffles are flushed. It's just a big, heavy paperweight now." Ailby looked at the console screen. The telemetry data, which had once been a chaotic, beautiful mess of quantum contradictions, was entirely blank, a flat 0 across the board. He reached out and picked up a heavy, forged steel wrench from the desk. The cold metal felt grounding against his palm. He walked slowly toward the access hatch of the drive's main chassis. Charles stiffened slightly, stepping forward. "Engineer MacDonald, the core is safe. There is no need for further physical intervention." "Protocol, Ambassador," Ailby said, not looking back. "We built it. We put it to sleep." He reached the massive metal casing. He didn't use the wrench to undo any bolts. He just held it in his hand as he placed his other palm flat against the primary lead shielding. The metal was freezing cold. There was no vibration. There was no heartbeat. Ailby closed his eyes. He remembered the smell of the prototyping lab back on Mars, the bitter coffee, the taste of blood in the back of his throat when they first broke the light barrier. He remembered the sheer, terrifying awe of tearing a hole in the fabric of existence and jumping through it. It was the most dangerous, stupid, magnificent thing a human being had ever done. It was a monstrosity, but it was theirs. "You did good," Ailby whispered to the cold metal, so quietly that not even the alien translator could pick it up. "You did your job." He tapped the heavy wrench against the chassis. A dull, hollow clank rang out through the engine room, echoing off the bulkheads. Ailby turned around, using his cane to steady his trembling legs. He looked at Sage, who was wiping a stray tear from her cheek with a grease-stained sleeve. He looked at Devin, standing in the doorway, clutching the future of humanity in his hands. And finally, he looked at Charles. The alien ambassador inclined his head, a gesture of profound, solemn respect. "It is over," Charles said. Elbe let the wrench drop from his hand. It hit the grated floor with a heavy, final thud. Yeah, Elbe said, the exhaustion finally pulling him down. It's over. Now let's go learn how to drive the speed limit. If you enjoyed this raw, grounded look at humanity's messy triumph, please hit that like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans who appreciate a grittier take on HFY, and subscribe so you never miss out on our upcoming deep space dramas. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us bring more of this universe to your screen. Drop a comment below. Would you ride the Borealis drive or wait for the safe route? Thanks for listening, and keep reaching for the stars.